Hello, everyone. Thanks for braving the fair traffic and the impeded parking to be here today. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. And we're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, where these videos are available to watch anytime afterward. And if you've not already done so, please silence your phone. It's October, so there's a new display of creepy dolls from the MDA collection in the lobby. I hope you saw them. The 6 dolls date from the mid-19th to the early 20th centuries and give an eerie glimpse into children's playthings from the past. Be sure to look for them by the museum store as you leave. Join us this Sunday, October 13th at 2 p.m., when we'll have a free screening of the documentary Little Brother of War. Directed by Brian Carpenter, the 90-minute film focuses on the Native American game of stickball and the struggle by the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians to keep their traditions alive in the modern day. The director, Brian Carpenter, will join us for a post-screening discussion along with Jay Wesley and Casey Big Pond from the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians. It should be really good. Finally, I hope you'll come back next week for History's Lunch when photographer Margot Cooper will discuss her new book, Deep Inside the Blues. Today's speaker is Michael Streiskuth, and he is the curator of the traveling exhibit now open upstairs, Atomic Alert, Confronting the Bomb in the New Atomic Age. He'll present Protecting the Home Front, Women in Civil Defense, 1950 to 1960. He'll also give a gallery talk in the exhibit space tomorrow at 11, so put that on your calendars. Michael Scheibach is an independent scholar, specializing in the history of the early Cold War. He earned his BA in English and his MA in History from the University of Missouri at Kansas City, and his PhD in American Studies from the University of Kansas. Scheibach is the author of 4 books, including Atomic Narratives and American Youth, Coming of Age with the Atom, 1945 to 1955, and Atomic Alert, The Atomic Bomb and the Show That May Save Your Life. Help me welcome Michael Scheibach to the stage.
Oh, good afternoon, and thank you for coming. I do have one request, suggestion or request. Rather than look back through time at what we're going to be discussing today, try to put yourself back in that period when you really don't know what the next week is going to bring or what the next year is going to bring. When we look back, we know that there was no atomic war in the 1950s. But in 1950, you did not know that. So let's start. In 1954, the Motorola Television Hour broadcast a fictional program titled Atomic Attack about nuclear bombs hitting New York City and cities across the country. But because television was live in the early 50s, and there were still memories of the great Orson Welles radio broadcast War of the Worlds in 1938, ABC, which broadcast Atomic Attack, decided that they needed to warn the public that what they were going to see on their program was just fiction. So here are a couple of articles that ran about the program. This is an Associated Press article. ABC wants it known that the Atomic Attack program on its television network tonight will not be real. And a little bit more explicit article that ran in the San Mateo newspaper, The Times. ABC notified the Federal Civil Defense Administration, and it in turn alerted its some 3,400 regional offices who are supposed to have warned the local offices. Anyway, if you think tonight's drama is a little too realistic, don't rush to the phone. Just relax. It's only fiction. The story focuses on Gladys Mitchell. She's a housewife in Westchester, New York, a suburb of New York City. She has a husband that works in the city and 2 school-aged daughters. She has a very comfortable life until one day after she sends her husband off to work and her children off to school, everything changes.
But are entirely fictitious, of course. It is the prayer of every one of us that such happenings shall forever remain fictitious.
Come on now, up and out of the house. The jackets will be done. I'm sorry, Mom.
Come on, kids. I'll let you to
The meeting's going to be at 8 o'clock. All right. Come on. I don't know that.
Goodbye, darling.
The meeting should be over by
Hurry up,
I'll tell you all this. You're welcome to come home at the end of the day, every one of you. I'll be happy to see you.
Now you wait right there, Michael, so I can home.
You. Bye. Oh, that's you again. Harry? No. No, it can't be. Children. John.
The bomb was probably carried by a guided missile launched from a submarine at sea.
No.
All civil defense workers report to emergency stations immediately.
Children.
Stay where you are unless you're in immediate danger. Do not attempt to join your children if they're in school. They are being well taken care of where they are. Do not try to telephone. Remember, radioactivity may make food and water in open containers dangerous. Use canned or otherwise protected foods until further notice. Do not attempt to inquire about relatives in New York. As yet, there is no information.
Oh, Jim Turner from the gas station.
In a new line of work right now, Mrs. Mitchell. I'm your block warden. Here is a full set of instructions for your family.
Thank you. Vital facts for civilians. Effects of radiation. Community organization. Think of everything.
Well, we trained for it long enough. Civil defense. Some folks thought it was a kid's game. You know, lots of laughs. Just a game. Some game.
In this house just 10 days ago. One will never be back. And another.
Mommy,
Yes, Jenny.
are we winning? Are we? I have to. Are we winning, Mommy?
Not yet, darling. But we're going to. I promise you that, Jenny dear. We are going to win.
So what we see with Gladys is that in the beginning she panics. Of course, she loses her husband in New York City. Then she learns a little more about civil defense, and at the end, she shows strength to her children that it is going to be okay. And to really understand the significance or the impact of this program, we have to go back to the beginning. And the beginning was August 6, 1945. And that was the day a specially equipped B-29 Superfortress, it was called the Enola Gay, dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. And the day after that, newspapers around the country reported the bombing and the introduction of the world's most devastating destructive weapon. Here are just some examples. Pittsburgh Press, atom bomb shatters city. In Grand Rapids, the city dissolved by atomic bomb. The Hattiesburg American, atom Japs must quit. The Daily Herald, Hiroshima destroyed by solitary atomic bomb. And the Clarion Ledger, war's mightiest weapon hits Japan. And the Clarion Ledger ran an AP article, and here's what it said. The United States unleashed Monday the most terrible weapon in the history of war, an atomic bomb carrying the destructive power of 2,000 superforts that crashed with annihilating force on a Japanese army base. Official sources here remain silent, but Secretary of War Stimson declared in Washington that the big base and port of Hiroshima on Japan's inland sea was engulfed in an impenetrable cloud of dust and smoke. And of course, Americans would soon learn that the bomb actually destroyed the city of Hiroshima, killing about 70,000 instantly and about 200,000 over the next few months. 3 days later, the United States bombed Nagasaki with a second atomic bomb. And 5 days after that, a war that had continued for 4 years, almost 4 years for the United States, came to an end when on August 14th, Japan surrendered, becoming VJ Day. And VJ Day, again, marked the end of World War II, but it also marked the beginning of the post-war era, the beginning of the Cold War, and perhaps most important, it began the atomic age. You would think that Americans would be extremely happy that we won the war. At the time, we were the only nation with an atomic bomb. But Gallup did a survey in October, just 2 months after VJ Day. And what they found is that 59% of the Americans polled thought there would be another war in 20 years. 2 years later, it actually increased to 77% thinking there would be another war in 20 years. In 1948, and remember, we were still the only nation with an atomic bomb. 57% thought there'd be a war in 10 years, and 45% expected a war in the next 4 years. So even though we were at that moment the most powerful nation in the world, you can see the anxiety and nervousness and fear that we would have another war. And then everything changed in August of 1949 when the Soviet Union, 4 years to the month after we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, exploded its own atomic bomb. And then just a couple of months later, Mao Zedong formed the Communist People's Republic of China. So what we see is by 1950, communism is spreading, and even more important, the U.S. now had an atomic armed adversary. And so when we get to the 50s, and one of the things that you often hear about the 50s is that they were the fabulous 50s. But I would argue they were also the fearful 50s. In 1950, in February of 1950, the junior senator from Wisconsin, Joe McCarthy, raised a sheet of paper and said he had 250 names of communists that worked for the State Department, and in so doing launched what became known as McCarthyism and the Second Red Scare of the 1950s. And then in June of 1950, communist North Korea, with support from both China and the Soviet Union, invaded South Korea and began the Korean War. President Harry Truman at the time knew that things were escalating, and he issued a proclamation on a national emergency in December of 1950, and it read in part, "Whereas the increasing menace of the forces of communist aggression requires that the national defense of the United States be strengthened as speedily as possible." And then the following month, the Federal Civil Defense Administration began. The became the primary agency to oversee the nation's civil defense program. And the FCDA had a very challenging goal. It was actually a dual goal. On the one hand, they had to convince Americans that this was a very real threat of an atomic war, and they had to be prepared for the worst scenario. And at the same time, they had to convince Americans that they could survive. So it was a dual goal. Things are really bad, but you can survive. And it's really the creation of the FCDA that began what I would call the era of women in civil defense. The FCDA's strategy was to connect the need to protect the nation with the need to protect the community and ultimately the need to protect the family. And the FCDA estimated that there would be 70 to 80% of the volunteers would be women. In its first report in 1951, the FCDA said the strength and courage of American women, traditional guardians of the home, is one of the nation's greatest resources. If the women of this country will prepare with courage and determination, we will have the civil defense we need to be strong. In addition to overseeing the massive National Civil Defense Program, it also produced brochures and pamphlets and posters, produced films, of course, the one that many of us may have seen, Duck and Cover, and it also worked with state and local organizations to help them produce civil defense materials. Between 1951 and 1961, there were some 400 million pieces of civil defense literature distributed in the country when the population was about 170 million. So in the early 50s, you would start to see these kinds of brochures that would be distributed free. The one on the left, You and the Atomic Bomb, was distributed by the New York State Civil Defense Commission. The FCDA produced Survival Under Atomic Attack. That's Denver on the left, just in case atom bombs fall. The state of Ohio on the right, it could happen here. Baltimore, this was a Sunday supplement, what to do if an atomic bomb strikes. The one on the right, If We Are Bombed, was a Cincinnati civil defense brochure. And two of the more explicit ones, sort of my favorites, if you will. Birmingham, Alabama, when the bomb goes off, don't be there. I think that's very good advice. In Seattle, don't sit under the mushroom. And most of these brochures had some type of map similar to this. Again, this is the period before missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles. So Russian bombers would be delivering the atomic bomb. So you would see a map similar to this, showing, in this example, 6 hours to bomb Seattle, 9 hours to reach Omaha, Nebraska. If you wanted to get your own personal manual, you could contact your local civil defense organization, such as the example here, Milwaukee. States also produced very extensive manuals for all state employees. This is an example from Missouri. And cities also produce manuals for all their employees, whether the police, the fire, anyone that works for a city would get this brochure telling them exactly what to do and how to handle an atomic war. And if you went to the grocery store, the office, the post office, you would see brochures or posters like this. And one of the messages that was really being emphasized was the one on the right there. Civilians can be bombed. That was the main thrust of the government. Women were also very prominent in these posters. These examples showing women protecting their family and being encouraged to volunteer for civil defense. And in fact, they were called to duty. In 1950, before the FCDA, there was the Office of Civil Defense Planning, and the head of it, William Gill, said, "Recognition has been given to the principle that women can do almost any wartime task for which men are capable, on the assumption that women are given the same amount of training or have equivalent background of experience." This is one of the first FCDA brochures, Women in Civil Defense. Whether you are a housewife, secretary, business executive, or nurse, civil defense looks to you as a woman to take an active role in protecting your home, to be as safe as possible against the danger of enemy attack. If your community does not have an active civil defense organization, much of the blame must fall on you and your neighbors. Unless you, as a responsible American woman, take action, you are gambling with the safety of your family, your friends, your community, and your country. Here's another brochure, Homemaker's Manual for Civil Defense. An enemy who, by merely threatening, can terrify the homemakers of America has already won a large victory. We can fight panic with information. So states began publishing brochures just for women to encourage women to volunteer. The Ohio here on the left, Georgia on the right. By the way, samples of these brochures are on the table here in front if you'd like to look at them later. Of course, women being involved in national defense was not new. Of course, we know in World War II they were very prominent in war production. About 36% of the labor force was composed of women. After the war, of course, many women voluntarily went back home. Others were fired or laid off. And historians, when they have looked at this post-war period, have talked about women primarily being the managers of the house, and some even use that term containment, that women were contained in the home. But I would argue that civil defense really allowed them to go beyond containment. 17 million women worked outside the home in 1950. It was about 27% of the labor force, and it would continue to increase during the 1950s. This is an interesting article published on the Cold War Museum's website called Women Defend the Nation. The nation's campaign to prepare for possible nuclear war allowed women to escape the narrow confinements of acceptable female behavior in the name of patriotism. Women's prominent involvement in civil defense therefore challenges the notion that the 1950s remained a dormant period for women's activities in the United States, and which we'll see here in the next few minutes, millions of women participated in civil defense. There were many paid positions. The national FCDA, as well as all the regional offices of the FCDA. Every state had civil defense organizations, some with women's divisions, and of course there were local civil defense offices. The FCDA also provided a number of opportunities for women to volunteer. The communication service, the transportation service, rescue, welfare, the health service. They could be auxiliary police. They could participate in mass feeding, staff service, the nursing service, and the warden service. Initially, the FCDA said that it hoped to have 17 million Americans sign up in the first year. And of course, that was a pretty lofty goal, but still 4 million men and women did sign up with the FCDA volunteer program in its first year. This included 550,000 men and women who completed the warden service, and block wardens were usually given 15 to 20 homes, and their job was to make sure all of these homes were prepared for an atomic attack. This is just one example of the training that women took. Pennsylvania opened a Civil Defense Training Center in 1952 to train women wardens in firefighting, rescue work, how to organize a block to minimize panic, and how to handle the homeless after an atomic attack. Catherine Howard, who is the head of the women's division of the FCDA, said, "Civil defense is a way to live calmly and courageously in a troubled world, and to keep on living. It is a way to work and work hard for the things we Americans believe in. But it is not an easy way, because there is no easy way to security. That is why our local civil defense organizations must have the active participation and support of women everywhere." And I just want to emphasize that there was a real belief in the early 1950s that civil defense would be a part of our lives forever, that it was just something that we had to be on alert all the time for a possible Soviet attack. This is a video, again, FCDA video, that gives you a good example of the many areas that women participated in. It was called Time of Disaster.
The moment when disaster struck. For the people of this community, time suddenly stopped. For them, their world of peace and order was suddenly brought to an end. This is the town, a community with a civil defense plan to meet a major disaster. The time is any time, the place anywhere in the United States. In the courthouse building is the office of the local civil defense director. At his disposal are volunteers, some with civil defense training. He knows the location of needed equipment and supplies. He knows that in the event of major disaster, he and his state can call on the Federal Civil Defense Administration for financial aid and the help of other federal agencies. The local civil defense headquarters or the control center become the focal point in a great mass effort by all organized groups and volunteers. Near the site of this major disaster, volunteers help route traffic. Many normal communication facilities have been temporarily knocked out, but walkie-talkies are manned by civil defense trained volunteers stationed at disaster points throughout the city, while others work at communication centers or as messengers. Survivors receive first aid treatment, while the more seriously injured are removed to a hospital where facilities are provided to meet the emergency. Here in this major disaster, the federal stockpile of emergency medical supplies and equipment is made available. Providing emergency care for disaster sufferers is a responsibility of the American Red Cross, which sets up registration and information services and provides victims with food, shelter, and clothing.
In May of 1951, the FCDA met with 1,000 representatives of 268 organizations to discuss developing civil defense programs. And at the time, it formed the National Women's Advisory Committee to evaluate how best to recruit women into civil defense. And the committee was composed of organizations representing some 26 million women, as well as directors of women's civil defense activities at the federal, state, and local levels. I ran across just a few of the many names of women in Mississippi. These are just some of the women here in Jackson in the 1950s. Of course, newspapers always address women in terms of their marital status, but it gives you an idea of Mrs. J.B. Fountain, who was a state coordinator of women in civil defense. Mrs. Eugene Payne Jr. was the chairman of Jackson's Women's Civil Defense. Mrs. Morris Davidson, chairman of the Women's Division of Civil Defense for the Capital Business and Professional Women's Club. And Mrs. Alex Rogers, the civilian administrative supervisor for the Jackson Air Defense Filter Center, which we'll talk about here shortly. An article in the Clarion Ledger in 1952 talked about a group of women getting together to talk about the importance of radio communications around the city in case of an attack. And these women represented private organizations. This is just an example of a few of them representing the YWCA, the Mississippi League of Women Voters, and the Jackson Junior League, all getting together to talk about the importance of communication. In November of 1952, this is where a meeting with Mrs. J.B. Fountain, and the article goes on to say, the council agreed that in working through the women's state organizations, the most interested and qualified women for this important work could be reached. Then in December of 1953, the speaker stated that while Jackson was not one of the 70 critical cities, these were also called target cities, the list of cities that were most likely to be attacked by the Soviet Union. A bomb hitting Jackson could destroy 75% of the city. So as I mentioned, not only government positions, but women participated through their own organizations. In 1952, the FCDA worked with 70 national women's organizations. 28 states had volunteer civil defense advisory committees composed of leaders of women's organizations, and 38 states had women serving in an executive civil defense capacity. In 1952, 70 women's organizations participated in the FCDA's Pledge for Home Defense campaign, again, urging women and men to volunteer for civil defense. And they were so successful that many mayors and even governors began issuing home defense proclamations, more or less award certificates for the effort to encourage women to volunteer. Also in 1953, 24 women's organizations distributed 80,000 civil defense materials at various women's activities. And 80 leaders of women's organizations in the western states established the Western Women's Training Conference to study civil defense and conduct demonstrations and exercises for women. So women were definitely on guard for the national defense, especially with the Ground Observer Corps. Of course, the Ground Observer Corps was created in World War II, but it was reformed in 1950. And in 1952, they finally launched Operation Skywatch. And at its peak, there were some 800,000 volunteers at 16,000 observation posts across the country. Again, women played a major role. They had varied backgrounds, varied racial groups, and ages, anything from a high school student to a senior citizen. Jackson was the site of a filter center, which received calls. Again, the filter center would work this way. observation posts would report in to the filter center. And the filter center had the important task of notifying the nearest military base to take action. This is an article from June of 1954, again talking about the filter center located at 416 North State Street. And the article says, excuse me, this spot could become in a moment the pulse of a frightened populace and the possible savior of thousands in the event of air attack from enemy forces. In December of 1954, a minimum of 12,000 volunteers will be assigned to at least 200 posts as members of the Mississippi Ground Observer Corps. And in 1956, they finally announced that Mrs. Alex Rogers was named the civilian administrative supervisor of the filter center. And the Clarion Ledger ran this photograph. And in 1956, Lee Meyer, who was a observation post supervisor, said, "We must have a large group of volunteer workers for this project, and women and high school students are needed as well as men. Students and women can man the post in the daylight, and men can take the shifts after dark." This is a little more showing you women as in the observation post as well as women in the filter center.
For this America of ours, in this world of today, one protection that we have against possible surprise attack from the air is a radar network encircling the country to warn us against the stealthy approach of an enemy.
Sue, can you identify it?
Strange. All our bombers have a white star and a blue background for identification. Jim, do you think it's
It could be, but we're not supposed to guess.
Aircraft flash, Elliot 84106.
Here's the info.
Air defense, go ahead. Aircraft flash, 1 Malta bomber, very low, no delay. Bravo Hotel 35, black, west, 1, flying south. Check, thank you.
The Fosters did their job well. Their aircraft flash was completed within the prescribed time. It took them less than 15 seconds.
This is a photograph of women in Maine working with a map showing the evacuation routes. There was also something called mass feeding that I mentioned earlier. In an atomic attack, it was expected there would be literally millions of Americans that would be without a home and would have to be fed. In Chicago, they estimated that if the city was attacked, there would be 600,000 people needing to be fed afterwards. Women were encouraged to take training for mass feeding, and the FCDA also helped organize training for members of the PTA and other women's organizations. I want to finish today with a group of women that is often overlooked, and that's teachers. Women held almost all the elementary teaching positions in the 1950s, and they were about 50% of the high school teachers. And they were, as teachers, they were very important for their students. As someone who went through grade school in the 50s myself, from duck and cover to just understanding what to do, teachers were very important. New York State Civil Defense Commission issued this statement: Nothing will so minimize fear and promote bravery among people as will an understanding of the nature of a pending catastrophe and how to act intelligently in the situation should it develop. The program in our schools is designed to give our children security and release them from fear through knowledge, and to help them know what to do and how to do it in order to protect themselves and others if disaster strikes. This, as early as 1951, I ran across this article in the Clarion Ledger. Members of the Broadmeadow PTA met to watch the FCDA's film, You Can Beat the Atom Bomb. Just wanted to show this final video talking about civil defense in schools and the role of teachers.
The threat of disaster is never pleasant. For a long time, schools have been improving ways of protecting children. These safety measures are essential. Today, however, we are threatened with a new form and magnitude of disaster. For this is the age of the atom. Existing school buildings throughout the system are surveyed to determine what areas within them are best adapted for shelter use or for ready conversion to shelters. With the help of the local civil defense director, the school superintendent makes certain that arrangements for evacuating schools in his system are coordinated with those already established for the community at large. Every school in the system receives this signal. On receipt of the warning, the switchboard operator immediately informs the principal. Using the public address system, he gives appropriate directions to his staff and to the students. It cannot be stressed too strongly that any civil defense warning signal used in schools must be clearly distinguishable from other types of alarms. No survival plan for schools can be effective without the full cooperation of an informed staff. The importance of the role of teachers in conducting shelter drills, for instance, cannot be overemphasized. In this 5th grade class, children make posters on home preparedness. Gradually, an awareness develops that civil defense is as natural, as meaningful, and necessary as everyday safety rules. The conditions of survival are learned.
So to kind of bring all this to conclusion, kind of probably overloaded you on information, but just to summarize what we've talked about. Women in the 1950s held executive and administrative positions in civil defense at all levels, federal, regional, state, and local. They volunteered for the many FCDA service areas like block wardens, auxiliary police, rescue, communications, and all the other programs that the FCDA offered. They actually conducted training in civil defense. They participated in civil defense activities in various organizations. As teachers, they taught the principles of civil defense and conducted civil defense drills like duck and cover. and they volunteered for the American Red Cross. They volunteered for the Ground Observer Corps to watch for approaching enemy bombers. They participated in civil defense meetings and conferences, and they participated in civil defense drills at the local, state, regional, and national levels. I'm going to
The FCDA.
skip through this. I just want to leave you with a final women's civil defense prayer. This was published by the Georgia Women in Civil Defense. And it says, O Heavenly Father, grant unto the women of this nation understanding that they may learn to serve both their country and their homes, so that in working for the one they may not sacrifice the other. Help them to choose the path that is right and to follow it through to the end, and let the love they cherish for their homes and the tolerance and courage that has come to them through their work go forth to ease the discord in this world, remembering always that they can have no strength without thy power. Amen. With that, I'd like to open it up for any comments or questions.
Thank you for that very informative presentation. I'm just wondering, we're talking about the time in the 1950s when the Jim Crow laws are still in existence, segregation is still prevalent, especially in the South, and so we don't get not until 1954 do we have Brown versus Board of Education and the beginning of segregation to begin. Well, not until later on in the 1950s that decision comes into effect. But what I'm basically asking is, how did segregation affect your FCD program? Because separation and segregation is still in existence at this time. And I'm wondering how did that impact this program that we're talking about, especially for black women?
Now, that is a very good question about the role of segregation and black Americans versus white Americans. I can say that black women's organizations around the country and other black organizations were part of the FCDA's efforts to bring everyone into civil defense. I've done research specifically on Kansas City area, where I'm from, and I can assure you that civil defense was as strong in all communities in Kansas City, black and white, segregated. There were segregated schools in the 50s, obviously, but they all had civil defense clubs, civil defense drills, but segregation obviously was an issue. Even though the FCDA is a federal agency, did not allow discrimination for any involvement with the FCDA. So it's not to say that in the South, in some areas, that the segregated areas did not exist. I wouldn't make that argument. So, and I will say that this presentation does seem to be, quote unquote, awfully white.
I'm glad you said that, because I was thinking exactly what he was thinking, and counting anyone of color in your pictures, and I think I saw about 3 people represented. And I'm sure these people were only thinking about white people. I can remember in the schools our drills consisted of the students marching out into the corridor, getting on their knees and covering their heads. That was it. There was no discussion about atomic bomb. So I think the effort was definitely selective, and they didn't care about anybody but the white people.
Very interesting. Two questions. The first one is, I noticed pictures of servicemen, and I know it was drafted in. How linked up was and I know they had stockpiles from World War II. How linked up was this entity with the military, the stockpiles, and all that? And then secondly, was there a corollary in the Soviet Union to this?
What was the last part?
Is there a corollary? I grabbed your hand, sorry. I got so excited. Anyway, was there a corollary to this in the Soviet Union, of the civil defense?
To the military connection?
No. In the Soviet Union, did they have an equivalent of, like home and hearth and women protecting and the civil defense initiative that we had in the United States? Did the Soviet Union have an equivalent of what you've been talking about today, civil defense organization?
You mean today?
No.
No, I'm sorry.
At the same time we were doing this, were the Soviets doing the same thing?
The Soviet Union. It's a very good question, and from what I know, the Soviet Union did not have an extensive civil defense program the way we did. It was much more extensive here in the United States. The one thing I should mention, again, just to kind of bring this to life, in July of 1953, the Soviet Union exploded a hydrogen bomb. We had exploded one in November of 1952. The Soviet Union, less than a year later, exploded a hydrogen bomb. At the same time in 1953, the Secretary of the Air Force made a public statement that we would only be able to stop 1/3 of the Russian bombers coming if they were to attack us. So as you can see, atomic attack, the program, which was 1954, again, very short period after the Soviet Union explodes an H-bomb, 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb at Hiroshima. And again, remembering, we're not looking back, we're actually living in 1954, and you're only less than a year removed from the Soviet Union having an H-bomb, and your own government telling you that they can't stop 2/3 of the bombers, as you saw coming over the North Pole. So you can understand the anxiety and the fear that many Americans had during that time. When did it end? Well, Operation Skywatch started in '52. In 1957, the Soviet Union tested an intercontinental ballistic missile. So now instead of hours, it would be minutes for the Soviet Union to hit the United States. So the Ground Observer Corps sort of ended toward the end of the 1950s. And of course, the one observation that you may have made about the Ground Observer Corps, again, very important, they took it very seriously, but if you can imagine, by the time you see an atomic bomb, a Russian bomber, and you report to the filter center, and the filter center notifies the military base, what are the odds of that bomber already dropping an atomic bomb? I mean, it was a very precarious situation that they meant well, But the truth is, if it really was a Russian bomber, it more than likely would have been able to bomb the United States by then.
I'm guessing there must have been some areas that were considered very low risk.
Low risk?
Because I never heard of any of this, but I lived in the country in northeast Mississippi, not close to any military base or any major city or anything. And I was in school in the 50s, you know, started first grade in 52. So I never heard of any of this. How did that happen?
That's a good question. Jackson was very involved in civil defense in the 1950s. You had a filter center here. You had civil defense programs, as some of the articles that I've talked about. It hosted Alert America, which was a traveling exhibit that only went to 82 cities, and Jackson was one of the cities. So at least in Jackson, civil defense was very prominent.
What?
No, thank you.
In your last comment, you alluded to the fact that, in fact, a great deal of this effort was based on things that were probably assumptions or presentations that were factually untrue. I noticed that also up in the exhibit at one point they're talking about it wasn't that bad in Hiroshima except for the people who actually got incinerated, which was also certainly by the early 50s known not to be true. To what degree do you think this entire campaign depended on, particularly that you might survive it aspect, depended on concealing things we already knew about what the launch from the Soviet Union and or our retaliatory launches would actually entail?
I'm not sure if this answers your question, but again, the FCDA had that dual role. They had to tell you that atomic war was a possibility. Back in the 50s, it actually was presented as a probability, and that you had to be prepared. But at the same time, as you can see from some of the brochures, if the bombs, drops, don't be there, that they had to make it sound as if you could survive. So some of the brochures, in fact, in the exhibit that's upstairs, it's almost, I want to say, laughable. It's funny. They actually used Mr. Civil Defense that was created by Al Capp, Little Abner's creator, to make it more, make it easier for you to accept the fact that atomic war is possible, but you could survive. So Americans really did understand the nature of the atomic war, but they were getting mixed signals from the government. If you duck and cover under your desk and they drop a bomb on Jackson and I'm under my desk, am I going to survive? Well, I would like to believe they made you believe that that was a possibility.
Michael, would you say a few words about, we've got photographs and pamphlets over here, what folks will see, and it's fine for them to pick them up and look at them and touch them?
Absolutely. There are a few brochures and pictures of the Alert America exhibit that was in Jackson in 1952, and just some pictures there. So you can kind of read what exactly the government was telling everyone.
And then maybe a word about tomorrow's gallery talk.
And tomorrow, I'm going to kind of switch and look at more of living in the atomic age, and what it was like to actually live. And a lot of the questions that we had today, I will address tomorrow when we talk more about everything that was going on in the United States during the 1950s.
We have copies of Alert America for sale. If anybody has another question or comment you didn't get a chance to ask, I'm sure Mike will be glad to talk to you about it over here. Don't forget, we have the Little Brother of War screening at 2 p.m. this Sunday. It's a really good movie. I have seen it, and I think everybody who watches it will enjoy it. Come back next week for History is Lunch, when we'll have Margot Cooper talking about her new book of photographs and interviews with Mississippi bluesmen. Now, help me thank Michael Scheibach for this fantastic program.